Welcome to HortTube, where we talk all things gardening. My name is Jim Putnam, and today we're going to talk about planting in sandy soils or extremely well-drained soils. Today we'll be talking about how to plant in sandy soils or soils that drain really well, or any type of soil that you think is going to dry out frequently between rains, and how we might amend those soils to improve them and hold some moisture in place between rains, and that way we have to do less watering. So let's talk about the tools we're going to need. This is a garden rake. It's a hard tine rake. I buy all my tools with fiberglass handles. This one has been with me for about 20 years since I started my landscape company. It's really beat up, it's bent at the top, but it still works great. I would encourage you to buy these. They're a little more expensive, but we don't need many tools for planting woody shrubs. So the 2 or 3 that I'm going to show you that you need, buy them as fiberglass handle tools and they'll be with you for a very long time. So the reason we're going to use a garden rake is if you're planting in an existing space that already has pine straw or hardwood mulch, this is great for pulling that away. We want to make a big space for our planting. We don't want to end up with any of that pine straw or hardwood mulch in our hole that we're planting our new shrub in. The next tool we're going to need is a pickaxe. I would encourage you to get a good one with a fiberglass handle, same as the garden rake and the same as the shovel I'll show you. I've worn this one out over 20 years. This was probably an inch longer. I've sharpened it many times over the years. We use the axe end of this to cut roots, and even if you're in like a sandier soil or a loam soil that's easy to dig in, you still need this tool because you're going to run into roots that you're going to need to cut, and that's what we're going to use the axe end of this tool for. If you get into a pocket where the soil's a little harder, it hasn't been dug, or maybe it's after new construction and the equipment has been on it and really compressed the soil quite a bit. It can be hard to dig around houses after new construction because of the heavy equipment that was used. This is the pick end, and I'll show you, we'll slam this into the ground, just using the weight of the tool really, and just pull back on it a little bit, and that'll break it up, and then we'll use our shovel to pull that out. Okay, so what type of shovel to purchase? Again, these are 2 different fiberglass handle shovel. This is just your regular digging spade. It's maybe 10 inches across and 10 or 12 inches deep. This is a trenching shovel. It's about 5 inches wide, and it was about 12 inches long. I've worn it out over the years. But if I have harder soils, or if I'm just not a person that's very physically strong, and you're a weekend warrior doing this, I would buy a trenching shovel. These things are super easy to slide down in the soil after we've used a pickaxe to break it up a little bit, whereas it can be very daunting. Just if you filled the shovel up just once, it might be 20 pounds worth of material on it to pull out of the hole. It's just kind of silly. If you're digging 5 or 6 holes, you don't really need to be in that big of a hurry anyway. So I just wouldn't purchase the shovel. If I'm going to the store and I'm buying 3 tools, I'm buying the garden rake, I'm buying a good pickaxe, and I'm going to buy a trenching shovel first before I buy this type of digging spade. Okay, so let's talk about soil amendments we might use when planting in sandier or well-drained soils. First of all, I want to rule out ever using anything that says potting mix or potting soil. These are materials that you would use when container planting your summer flowering annuals or vegetable plants in containers, or maybe your house plants, but it's not going to be very good for any woody shrub, either in the ground or in a container. It just stays too wet, and it just doesn't work well for woody shrubs, berrying plants, fruiting plants. It's just too much water for them. So we'll rule that out immediately. The other thing for sandy soils we're going to rule out is any kind of really chunky material. This is a pine bark soil conditioner here. It's a very chunky aged pine bark that just falls out of my hand here. That's going to actually increase the drainage of your sandy soils, and probably is not going to be a good idea to use in that application. The 3 things that would be okay to use would be a compost, which right here, this is a composted product that's a little chunkier. Might be one I'd want to use more in a clay-based soil. You can kind of feel along the bag and see how chunky it is before you purchase it. If you have very sandy soils or very well-drained soils, I might avoid one that's as chunky as this one is and use this one more in clay-based soils. The other issue we can run into with compost is we don't know the pH of it, and it's no big deal for what we're doing, we're talking about putting 3 shovelfuls of something in a hole to plant a shrub. But if you're using compost in an ongoing situation, like you're amending your vegetable garden every year with it, you'll want to check the pH on it, because we really don't know what the pH of this is. We don't know what it was that was composted to make the product. So it could be very alkaline or very acidic. So get that checked if it's something you're going to be doing every year to a space to improve it for your annuals or your vegetables or your perennials. The next thing we might consider using, and this would be a very good product to use in sandy soils or very well-drained soils, is peat moss. Peat moss has an amazing ability to hold water in place, to wick up water around it and hold it in place. The only issue with peat moss is it's truly not a renewable resource. This has been thousands of years in the making. This is grass that was matted down on itself and died every fall for years and years and years and years and thousands of years. And so as we mine this out in the future, we are going to run out of it at some point. It's just it's not a renewable resource. And so you might, lean toward compost or cow manure. I'll show you in a minute if you're concerned about, using something that, we're mining it out of the ground and we will run out of it at some point. The cow manure is the other item we could use. Cow manure has an amazing ability, a good product, a good cow manure has an amazing ability. It's composted, even though I'm handling it, it's not really disgusting. It has no smell, no nothing. It has an amazing ability to hold moisture in place and is absolutely fantastic to add when you're planting in sandy soils, just to slow the water from leaching out of the soil so quickly after rains. So now that we've picked the tools we're going to need and the amendments we're going to use to plant in our well-drained sandy soil, after we get them planted, we're going to need to mulch. And we mulch so that we prevent weeds from coming up and competing with our plants, and we also mulch to regulate the soil moisture. If you have pine straw available in your area, this is a bale of pine straw. This works absolutely fantastic. It does a great job of not keeping things too wet and does a great job of preventing weeds. It is a bit of a fire hazard if you live in an area that's prone to fires in the fall and winter. In some places it's actually been banned, and in some cities they don't allow it anymore on some buildings. But the other thing you can use is hardwood mulch. This is a bag of dyed brown hardwood mulch. You'll see more and more of that. There's brown, black, and red dyed mulch. They say the dye is organic. I'm assuming there's no problem with repeatedly putting it down in your yard, but I tend to use just regular double or triple shred hardwood mulch that you can buy in bulk or buy it in bags as well. Just make sure you're using a fairly thin coat, and I'll show you that after we plant, that we don't want to use too much of this material because it will choke out your plants. It just doesn't allow them to breathe and holds way too much water in place if you drown them in it. The other thing you can use is, you'll see rock being used as mulch, and gravel and decorative rocks. It's kind of a short-term thing in areas where it rains a lot. Leaves blow into it and it gets dirty over time. Weeds start to grow in it, and it's not the long-term solution you think it is, and it actually ends up being quite a bit of maintenance and time. But I understand that some people do like it, but I prefer to use either hardwood mulch or pine straw. One last thing you may see when you're purchasing soil amendments is many of them now have fertilizer in them. And that's okay with a potting soil, because potting soils, you're typically going to be planting your annuals in containers or your vegetables in containers or in the ground or that kind of thing. And that's okay. Even your houseplants are okay to fertilize when you transplant them. But it's not great for planting soils where we're planting shrubs and trees in the ground, because as an example, in my area, it's best to plant shrubs in the fall. And if I plant shrubs in the fall, I definitely don't want to fertilize them at the same time, because I may put on some growth on the plants that end up getting burned badly in the winter time. So buy these basic components I showed you and then fertilize in the spring or summer or whatever the appropriate time is for the plant that you're growing. This is an area we use at the nursery for taking cuttings off plants that we've planted in the ground. I've got a whole ridge of camellias up here above us that are in bloom right now. It's November, and I'm going to put this variegated pittosporum in the ground right here. I know this ground is very sandy. There's a farm field up above it that for years has washed into this area, and there's a pond behind here where the sand is always trying to get to. So I know this area that I'm standing on can get very, very dry. Even in times where we're getting some regular rainfall. If it's not a good drenching rain, this area will definitely get dry. The first thing I'm going to do here is use this garden rake like we talked about, and I'm just going to remove these leaves. There's not a bed here already. This is just some few low weeds that I'll need to get rid of, and then some leafy vegetation and pine straw that's fallen from the trees around it this fall. So I'm going to clean all that out with this rake, and I can push or pull with this thing, which is nice, but I'm going to give myself plenty of space. I don't want any of that organic material falling into this hole that I'll be digging. Okay, that's good for that. I'm going to show you real quick with this pickaxe. I'm unlikely in this space to end up with any roots where I would be using the pick end of this, and I can tell you already, this is so soft here that I don't even need to use the pick. I mean, this just dropping this, it goes all the way in. I want to be able to use the shovel, no problem. But here's another use we can use with this pick, is I can actually just drag it along the top of the ground just a little bit, and I can actually just take these roots of these weeds and just cut them off right below the surface, just like that. That should do them in pretty easily. And I can clear this whole space of weeds just like that. Obviously in clay it would be a little more effort than that, but in this sort of sandy loam soil, they actually just immediately come up very easily. And that should do it. I'm going to push that back out there just like that. That should kill them off. And I got most of those weeds before they were seeding themselves, so I don't expect many of these to come back. Of course, there's more seeds there that will eventually germinate, but the ones I got there, they're pretty much dead for sure. So our next step here is really just digging this hole. And like I say, I'm not going to have any problem in this sandy loam soil. And you know, sometimes soils that drain really, really well won't look like this. I've got an area behind me that we actually drive on, and I guarantee you if I tried to dig in that space where we've been compacting it for years, almost certainly I'd have to use the pick to go down, and even in this type of soil. So, you know, after your house has been built, and if it's new construction and they've been running equipment on it, it may be more like that road bed, and you may end up having to use that pick some to, you know, use the pick end of it and break that soil up some. But this is pretty easy space here to dig in. I got as much of a problem with the soil falling back into the hole as anything. I will hit some clay on this property. This property does have clay underneath this silt that washed off this field, and I can actually already see a little bit of it. It's not, the sand's not deep here. So there is a layer underneath. Almost certainly this water would fall through this sand pretty easily, hit that clay layer, and then just run along that layer and run right off this slope of this property under the ground and not soak in all that well probably. This is almost done here. I'll test fit this shrub and see. I'll leave it in the container when I test fit them and see if I've got it as deep as I want to go and as wide as I want to go. Okay, let's try that out. All right, I'm going to set that in there, and I actually think I've gone a little deep. Even in sandy soil like this, I don't want to plant the thing 3 inches deep and, you know, below the original grade and then pile soil or mulch up on it. I still want to mound it up a little bit. So I've definitely gone a little too deep here, and we'll rectify that when we mix organic material in with this soil. Okay, so I want to amend this sand. I've kind of got it wrapped around about 2/3 of the hole here. I'm not going to use any peat moss down here. I really prefer to use a good cow manure if I can get it. I think it holds water not quite as well as peat moss, but I like the fact that it's a renewable resource and typically is less expensive than peat moss. Peat moss is not only, like I told you, mined, it's also mined in Canada, and then it's kind of heavy. They're shipping it, you know, across country, and you know, cow manure I would think would be right here from more local spaces around you. You could probably find a local company actually that you can get it from, but I'm just going to take this cow manure. I busted the side of the bag. Typically I'd be planting a lot of plants, and I'll slit along the side of the bag like that so I can use my shovel for something like this. And I'll take just several shovelfuls. I want this about maybe a third or a little more cow manure and about 2/3 of this existing soil. That's about right. It's probably going to take about half of this 50-pound bag. So I probably get about 2 plants per bag out of it. And I'm not going to worry about mixing it in. It pretty much will take care of itself while I'm planting it. As I already showed you, I dug it a little bit too deep here, so I'm going to take some of this and I'm just going to flip it over like that. That will achieve the mixing that I'm looking for right there. Okay, let's set this back in here and see what that looks like. Now we're sitting up. We'll probably be sitting up about 1 inch when we're done here. So I think that's absolutely perfect. So I'm going to take this one out of the container. You can take the containers and beat on the side of them like this, and that'll loosen them. Frequently, I'll knock on the top of that rim of that, like that right there, and that'll just knock them right off, typically, after I've loosened them. This is a plant that has a heavy woody stem on it, this variegated pittosporum, so I don't mind holding it by this area. But if you had something that was a little more fragile or a little more wispy, you know, at the base like that, you need to flip them upside down, put your hand on the soil, and pull your container off this way. And that's the way you accomplish that. This pittosporum is not really root bound, meaning the roots aren't really tight on this one. I can do one of two things. If it's like this and they're really not wrapping around yet, I'll just go like this and just kind of use my fingertips, and I'll bring this over a little closer. You can see I can just knock a little bit of this soil off. Now all these roots, if you can see that, are now pointing outward and will continue to grow outward in this hole. If these had been wrapped around one another very tight, I just lay it down on the side here, and I'll take the shovel and just cut in about 1/2 inch right there, and then do it maybe 2 more times around like this, and that'll cut the roots that are wrapping around one another. And then we'll set him in the hole. Okay, so our plant's in the ground here. I'm going to just take the rest of this soil and just kind of knock it in around, and I won't fill all of one side up. I'll just get a little bit all the way around, and I'll keep it a few inches below the edge of my root ball, and I'll go ahead and tamp that one time. Coming around here like this, just with the toe of my shoe there. Okay, so that's tamped in pretty well, and then I'll fill up the rest of this trench that I just made with my shoe, and that's mixing that cow manure in pretty well at the same time. And we'll go around one more time, tamp all this down, and I'll just move this extra soil with me as I go. It'll find a home eventually as I go like that. Okay, so that's pretty much perfect. He's in the ground, tamped in. I'll come back in here and pull off any soil off the top of that root ball that I just put on top of it. I still see the top of the root ball just like it was in the container. That's what I'm looking for. So that's absolutely perfect. In the ground, organic material, tamped in. Not going to fertilize because it's the fall. At this point, we'll want to put some sort of mulch on this plant, and I've got these leaves and natural things falling off these trees. I don't mulch these beds up here just because I have all this organic material that falls off these trees in the fall, so I really don't need to in this area. And it's not the front of my house. It's an area we're just using for cuttings. But if it were the front of my house, in this case, I'm just going to rake these leaves back. But if it were the front of my house, I'd use pine straw here, which tends to be more readily available in the southeast, and just put a 2 or 3 inch layer here around this and tuck it up under it. And then after I tuck it up under it, I'll go back and pull it back slightly from the base of it. Our other option, which I'm going to put on now, will be this hardwood mulch. This is a dyed brown mulch I'm going to pour. I used some of this bag in my clay soil planting video if you want to watch it. I'm going to pour a lot of the rest of this out. Okay. And what I just did is a great example of what happens on a job site, especially when I was landscaping. We'd go out to the curb, put some hardwood mulch in a wheelbarrow it to where it was going, and then dump it. And it ends up dumped right on the edge of that plant. Here's a close-up where we've got this plant planted, and then a big pile of mulch ended up landing basically on the side of it. It ends up getting kicked under the plant or raked under the plant, and then doesn't get pulled back from the plant. So it ends up causing problems with holding too much water or inviting pests. So to finish this up, I'm just going to take this mulch that I poured here, and I'm going to gently rake it around my plant. You can use the edge for this garden rake as well. I'll use that quite a bit, and even the back sometimes to smooth things out. And that's pretty much it on this. I'll go back, like I say, and just make sure that I didn't just pile mulch up on the trunk of this thing. And that'll be that. I'm going to take these leaves that I had in this area and just pull them back across here. I've got all kinds of debris in my way. And just pull this back all the way around and use that as my mulch in this area. And that's pretty much it on how I'll plant in soils that are going to drain really, really well. I did end up mounding the plant up a little bit. I don't plant it flush. I still mound it up. I just use some organic material that hopefully will hold a little bit of water in place or slow the water going down through that hole when it rains. This is at the bottom of a hill, so a lot of the water is going to settle here. Even though it dries out, it will end up settling into this space. So if I was planting up on that bank and it was the area where the water just washes off that really quickly, you may have seen me use a lot more of that cow manure, or maybe busted open that bag of peat moss and use some of that, because it will hold water a little better than that cow manure. Of course, the last step after everything's planted and mulched and everything is to get it watered. And in this case, I would put the water hose at the base of it and just set it on a trickle where it's just barely coming out, and leave it on there for a prolonged period of time and saturate the entire space around the plant that you just planted. If you're planting other plants, just water the one behind you as you're planting the next one and the next one and the next one. And then after you saturated that entire space around it, let that space dry out again before you water it. We do not need to water plants every day. I hear people say, I don't know what happened to it. I watered it every day. And the answer to what happened to it was they watered it every day. This shrub that I just put in the ground is not something that's going to need watering constantly. It probably, if you saturated this entire space around it and you live in an area that gets kind of normal rainfall, you're not in a desert climate, this plant's not going to need to be readdressed for a couple weeks probably. Even in extreme heat during the summertime, planting this plant, I might only address it once a week. And when you do, like I say, if it does need water, drown the space around it, and then do the same process of letting it dry out. That drying process is the trigger for that plant to go and root out into the surrounding soil. If it's never drying out at the base of that plant, it really has no reason to root out. And frequently, I can go back on a house that somebody bought. They've lived there for 2 years. We're going to do new landscaping there, and the house has been on an automated irrigation system. I can go put a shovel under the shrubs on the foundation and pop them out of the ground, and the root ball looks almost exactly the same as the day it was planted. The plant had no reason to search for water. In fact, it was probably trying to retreat from there was so much water around it. So let your plants dry out. It doesn't hurt them. Sometimes you'll lose a few leaves in the middle. They'll turn a little off color. They'll wilt some. They're better doing that than the opposite, which is rotting the roots, because if you do that, they won't recover from it. They just die. Okay, so that's the basics of planting in sandy soils or really, really well-drained soils. I also have another video on planting in clay or poorly draining soils if you want to watch it. Some of it's a little repetitive, but parts of it are unique to planting in those types of soils. Thank you very much for watching the video, and if it was helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for future videos. Also, comment below with any questions you have about planting. Thanks again.